Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. On the day that should have been filled with celebration, I walked into my son's home carrying a pie and the hope of belonging. But beneath the flags and the laughter, I felt the weight of distance. My daughter-in-law's smile was polished. My son's eyes were lowered, and I knew before a word was spoken that I was no longer welcome in the family I had built. I am Helen Caldwell, 72 years old, a mother, a widow, the keeper of a house they now plot to sell for $7 million. What they did not expect was that the very walls of that house carried history, and that my niece's secret recording would one day shatter their scheme. The July sun pressed heavy against my shoulders as I walked up the familiar driveway of my son's home in Fairfax, Virginia. The flags lined the street, neighbors grilling and children running with sparklers. I clutched the pie I had baked that morning, forcing a smile as I stepped onto the porch. It was Independence Day, a day that was supposed to bring families together, not tear them apart. Rachel greeted me at the door with her practiced smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. She leaned in quickly, brushing her cheek against mine, her perfume sharp and deliberate. Mark stood just behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He avoided my gaze as he ushered me inside. The dining room was already full of voices and clinking glasses, the table spread with red, white, and blue decorations that seemed almost too perfect, too staged. John had driven down from Boston for the holiday, and he rose from his chair to hug me warmly. His arms were steady and real, the kind of comfort I had missed since Richard passed. Across the table, Peter, my grandson, looked up from his phone. At 17, he was tall and awkward still, half a boy, half a man. He gave me a small smile that carried a trace of guilt. I settled into my seat at the far end, the pie placed carefully among the dishes already crowding the table. The chatter flowed around me, Rachel complimenting her own roast neighbors, commenting on fireworks schedules, Mark reminding everyone about the pool out back. I tried to join in, but felt more like a guest than family in this house I had helped them purchase years ago. My mother's antique china gleamed under the chandelier pieces I had given them when they married, now set out like trophies. I traced the rim of my glass with a trembling finger, reminding myself to breathe, to endure. Rachel suddenly rose, glass of wine in hand. She tapped it lightly with her fork, silencing the room. Her posture was straight, her smile wide enough for photographs. I watched her lips move before I could process the words. She said it with the same bright cheer one might use to announce a promotion. "It is time this old woman finds a place of her own." The words fell like stones, each syllable striking against the table. I felt the sting in my chest, heat rising to my face. For a moment I thought I had misheard. My eyes darted to Mark, but he stared at the tablecloth as though it were covered in secrets. John shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Peter's fork clattered softly against his plate, his cheeks flushing as he looked down. I could feel every eye at that table pressing against me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to crumble. My throat tightened. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain still. My fingers dug into the fabric of my napkin, resting on my lap. 1,000 memories rushed in, nights spent rocking Mark through fevers, mornings making his lunch for school, years of sacrifice that had led me to this moment where he would not even defend me. Rachel's face was calm, her smile delicate, as if she had just complimented the dessert. My mind screamed at me to speak, to lash out, but my body betrayed me with silence. The sound of glasses shifting, someone clearing a throat, the muffled buzz of conversation returning slowly like timid waves. John glanced at me finally, his eyes heavy with pity and restrained anger. I wanted him to speak to protect me, but his lips remained closed. Perhaps he did not want to ruin the day further. Perhaps he thought I would handle it myself. Peter's shoulders hunched, the boy ashamed, yet unsure of how to act. Mark lifted his head only briefly, murmuring something about his mother needing rest, about how the big house must be so much for me to manage. His tone was soft, but it cut deep, the voice of a son I no longer recognized. I sat there, a hollow ringing in my ears, the taste of metal on my tongue. I pressed the napkin to my lap, more firmly willing my hands to stop shaking. Inside me, a spark lit faint, but real. This was not just insult. This was the beginning of something planned, something darker beneath the surface. Rachel's words were too deliberate, her timing too perfect. I forced a smile, one that felt brittle on my lips, and lifted my glass to sip water, though my throat was dry. My gaze traveled the length of the table, over the polished silverware, the glossy decorations, the faces of my family avoiding my eyes. I realized in that moment I was invisible in their home, but I would not be erased. The conversation resumed, laughter louder than before, as though nothing had happened. I sat in silence, letting the noise wash over me, my mind already moving. I thought of Richard, of the promises we had made to protect this house, this family. My chest ached, but beneath the ache, there was resolve. I dabbed the corner of my mouth with the napkin, rose carefully, and excused myself to the kitchen. My steps were steady, though my legs trembled. I needed space, air, a moment to gather what remained of my dignity. Behind me, I heard Rachel laugh, the sound sharp and victorious. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the flags ripple outside, the sunlight glinting off parked cars along the street. My reflection in the glass showed a woman older, smaller than I remembered, but the eyes staring back were not broken. They were steady, focused. The voices from the dining room grew louder again, Rachel telling a story, Mark chiming in with forced cheer. I pressed my palm against the cool counter and breathed slowly. The hurt burned, but so did something else, something stronger. I returned to the table minutes later, composed, every trace of tears wiped away. I eased back into my chair, folded my napkin neatly, and lifted my head. I met Rachel's eyes across the table. Her smile wavered just slightly, as if she sensed the shift inside me. The fireworks had not yet begun outside, but inside me the fuse was lit. This was only the beginning. Mark caught up with me as I stepped out onto the porch after the dishes had been cleared, and the evening air carried the distant sound of fireworks testing in the neighborhood. He closed the door behind him and shifted from foot to foot, hands in his pockets, like a boy who had been caught in a lie. He cleared his throat and spoke softly, as if lowering his voice might soften the blow. "Mom, you know we worry about you in that big old house. It must be so much to handle all on your own. Have you thought about moving into one of those senior communities? They are safe, comfortable, and you would not have to deal with the upkeep." The words settled heavy in my chest, and I stared at him, my own son, the boy I had carried through sickness and heartbreak. His eyes flickered toward the window where Rachel stood with her glass of wine, pretending to chat with a neighbor, but watching us all the same. He could not meet my gaze for long. My voice came out measured, though my heart pounded. "Mark, I have managed that house for decades. I am not helpless." He nodded quickly, too quickly, as if rehearsed. "I know, Mom. I just think it might be better for everyone. Less stress for you, more convenient for us. You would not be alone anymore." I saw through every word. It was Rachel's script spilling from his lips, dressed up in concern. I wanted to scream, to ask him how he could betray me so easily, but I forced myself to stand tall. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "If you think Rachel's words will push me out of my home, you do not know me as well as you think." His face paled slightly, and he rubbed the back of his neck like a child caught in mischief. He mumbled something about just wanting what was best, then turned back into the house before I could answer. I stood on that porch alone the July evening, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The sound of laughter inside Rachel's sharp tone rising above it twisted in my stomach. I walked down the driveway slowly, each step heavier than the last, the pie dish empty in my hands. Driving home through the quiet streets, I thought of Mark as a boy running across the yard, barefoot, hair sticking up in all directions. I thought of late nights, nursing him through fevers of mornings spent packing his lunch of his hand, clutching mine on his first day of school. I had given everything I had, and now he stood with a woman who dismissed me as a burden. The betrayal cut deeper than Rachel's words ever could. When I reached my house, the familiar brick walls greeted me in the dusk. The porch light glowed faintly. The garden I had tended alone for 3 years since Richard's death stood still in the humid air. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the scent of old wood and lavender, the scent of home. I set the pie dish in the sink and leaned against the counter, my hands trembling. I had always imagined this home as my anchor, a place where my children would return, where my grandchildren would learn to bake cookies in the kitchen, where family would gather for holidays. Now it was the very thing they were plotting to take from me. I wandered into the living room, my fingers brushing across the back of the worn armchair where Richard used to sit with his books. The silence of the house was both comforting and crushing. I lowered myself into the chair and closed my eyes, feeling the ache of loneliness and the sting of betrayal. But underneath the hurt, a sharper awareness grew. Rachel's toast had not been careless cruelty. It was a deliberate strike, a test to see if I would bend. Mark's quiet echo of her suggestion proved it was not just idle talk. This was a plan taking root, and if I let them, they would strip me of everything I had built. I rose from the chair and walked slowly through each room, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs. Mark's childhood drawings still hung in the hallway, faded with time. The dining table where we had celebrated birthdays and Christmas still bore a small scratch from Peter, dragging his toy car across it years ago. Every mark told a story, every corner held memory. None of it was just mine. It was the legacy of generations before and after me. I reached the staircase and paused, staring up toward the attic door. Richard had always kept his papers and journals there, documents from his work as an architect, and boxes that belonged to his father and grandfather. I had not opened them since his passing in 2020. A part of me feared what memories might spill out. Another part of me wondered if within those boxes lay something that could protect this house, something Rachel and Mark could never touch. The night was heavy crickets humming outside, the hum of the air conditioner faint in the background. I pressed my palm against the stair rail and exhaled slowly. I was tired, but more than tired, I was alert. I could not allow myself to drift into denial. This was not just about aging, not just about being practical. It was about control, about greed, and about erasing me before my time. I turned away from the staircase, choosing rest over exploration, at least for that night. Tomorrow would bring its own burdens, and I needed strength. I made my way to the bedroom, the sheets cool and familiar, the bedside lamp casting a soft glow. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning with Mark's words, with Rachel's smug smile, with the silence of those who had chosen not to defend me. Sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it was restless, filled with half-dreams of doors closing, of voices whispering, of papers being signed without my consent. I woke before dawn, the first light slipping through the curtains, my heart pounding as if I had been running. I sat on the edge of the bed, steadied my breathing, and pressed my feet firmly against the floor. I knew then that yesterday had not been an isolated insult. It was the first step in a battle I had not chosen, but would have to fight. I would not be cast aside quietly. I would not let them take my home. The house that had held my life, my love, my history, was worth more than their schemes. It was worth my resolve. I rose with the morning light, ready to face whatever came next. The morning light spilled across the fields outside my window, bathing the old brick walls of the house in gold. I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, my fingers wrapped tightly around the mug as if warmth alone could steady me. Every creak of the floorboard seemed louder than usual, every shadow more pronounced. I could not ignore the thought pressing at the back of my mind. If Mark and Rachel had their way, this house would no longer be mine. I walked through the quiet rooms, my footsteps echoing softly. Each space carried the imprint of a life lived, not just mine, but Richard's, John's, Mark's, and even little Peter when he was a boy. I paused at the family photos lining the hallway, my eyes catching Richard's smile, frozen in time, his arm looped around me in front of this very house. I felt a tug deep in my chest, the ache of loss mingled with the ache of fear. The attic door loomed at the top of the stairs, its brass knob dulled with age. Richard had spent countless hours up there, rifling through old trunks, muttering about history and preservation. I had not stepped inside since the day after his funeral in 2020. That place was too heavy with memory too still, but now something stronger than grief pushed me forward. If there was anything hidden that could protect this home, I had to find it. I retrieved the small key from the drawer in my desk and climbed the stairs slowly, the wood groaning beneath me. Dust floated in the thin shaft of sunlight from the small round window as I turned the lock and pushed the door open. The scent of cedar and old paper wrapped around me instantly as though time had been waiting patiently for me to return. Boxes and trunks were stacked neatly, each marked with Richard's careful handwriting. I trailed my fingers across them, remembering his voice explaining family stories, his passion for preserving the past. Toward the back sat a leather trunk worn smooth at the edges. I knelt before it, my knees protesting, and unlatched the brass clasps. Inside lay stacks of journals bound in leather bundles of letters tied with ribbon envelopes, labeled in Richard's precise script. My eyes caught on one in particular. Helen read in case of disputes over the house. My hands trembled as I lifted it out, my pulse quickening. Richard had prepared for this possibility, had known our children might one day challenge what was ours. I unfolded the letter, his handwriting instantly familiar. He wrote that during renovations years earlier, he had discovered documents sealed within a hidden compartment in the East Wing. They were letters exchanged between Jonathan Caldwell, one of his ancestors, and prominent figures of the Revolutionary period. Richard had consulted a trusted historian, Professor Martin Wallace, who confirmed their authenticity. These letters revealed that our home had been used as a meeting place for patriots planning the early framework of the nation. I pressed the paper to my chest, my eyes stinging with tears. Even from beyond the grave, Richard had been protecting me, protecting this house. My fear mingled with awe. This was more than a home. It was a piece of American history. I sorted through the rest of the documents, careful not to tear the fragile pages. Among them were authentication papers bearing university seals, photographs of the original correspondence, and a written assessment estimating both historical and financial value. My breath caught as I read. The property could qualify as a historical landmark, making it nearly impossible to sell or demolish. For a long moment I sat in the dust and silence, my heart pounding with both hope and dread. Rachel and Mark could not have known about these papers, yet their plan was already in motion. If they succeeded before I acted, everything would be gone. A floorboard creaked beneath my shifting weight, and I froze, half expecting Rachel's sharp voice behind me, though of course I was alone. I laughed bitterly at myself, then tucked the envelope securely under my arm. I rose slowly, brushing dust from my skirt, and carried the trunk's contents down to the study. The study smelled faintly of Richard's old pipe, though he had not smoked in years before his death. I spread the documents across the desk, each one a shield against the threat looming over me. I imagined Rachel's polished smile cracking when confronted with undeniable proof that this home was more than real estate. It was history. Yet fear lingered. What if the courts ignored it? What if greed triumphed? I could see Rachel's face as she toasted at that table, certain of her power. I clenched my fists until my nails pressed crescents into my palms. I would not be erased. Outside, the cicadas droned in the humid Virginia air. I rose and drew the curtains, shutting out the brightness. My reflection in the glass showed a woman worn, but not broken. I whispered to Richard, though the room was empty, telling him I had found what he left, that I would not let his effort be in vain. The clock in the hallway chimed noon, startling me. I gathered the papers back into the envelope and locked it in the desk drawer. The key rested cool in my hand. I would keep it with me always now. I sank into the armchair and let out a shaky breath. My body trembled with the weight of discovery, but beneath it ran a current of strength. Rachel thought I was an old woman to be dismissed, but she had no idea what this house carried within its walls. As the afternoon light dimmed, I closed my eyes briefly. My mind turned not to rest, but to strategy. I would need allies, and soon. But for the moment, I allowed myself one more pause, listening to the silence of the house, feeling Richard's presence steadying me, and promising myself that I would fight. The day after the attic discovery, I woke restless, the weight of those papers still pressing on my mind. The July air was thick, heavy with humidity, and the cicadas outside had begun their endless song before the sun even cleared the trees. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing my coffee cup, staring through the window at the driveway where Richard used to park his truck. For years I had felt safe in this home, sheltered by its history and memory, but now I felt like prey in a place I once considered fortress. I decided to tend to the garden, hoping the rhythm of watering and pruning would steady me. Carrying the can out to the roses Richard had planted when Mark was just a boy, I bent down and brushed a withered petal between my fingers. That was when movement across the road caught my attention. A man stood there, camera raised, snapping photos of the house, as if it were his to sell. My heart stuttered, the can trembling in my grip. I straightened and walked toward him, each step deliberate, though my pulse raced. He lowered the camera too slowly, sliding it against his chest as if caught in a secret. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his tone smooth, rehearsed. Thomas Reynolds. Real estate. Just documenting the property for a client. Documenting my property. The words cut through me. I asked who had authorized him, my voice firm, though my throat was dry. His eyes flicked away, and he shifted on his feet. It is just standard procedure, nothing to worry about. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a card, then hesitated and slipped it back. Without offering another word, he turned, hurried to his car, and drove off, leaving the smell of exhaust in the hot air. I stood at the edge of the driveway staring after him, my hands shaking anger mixing with dread. Someone had invited him here, someone with no right to do so. I looked back at the house, its red brick glowing in the sun, and felt the first true wave of panic. Needing to move, I took my usual walk along the property line. The fields spread wide, and the tall hydrangeas rustled in the breeze. That was when I noticed something half hidden behind them, something that did not belong. I pushed the branches aside, and there it was, staked into the soil like a scar. A sign angled away from the house so only those driving by would see. Coming soon. Bold letters announced Reynolds Real Estate with a phone number beneath. My knees nearly buckled. I gripped the metal post with both hands and yanked it from the ground. Dirt clung to the bottom roots, snapped under the force. I carried it back like a piece of evidence, rage filling my chest. This was not speculation anymore. This was real, deliberate, already in motion. Inside the house, I set the sign against the wall, its white face glaring back at me. I picked up the phone and dialed Mark before I could even think. He answered on the third ring, his tone clipped. Mom. I demanded to know why a real estate agent had been on my lawn and why a sign had been hidden in my bushes. There was a long silence on the other end, then a practiced sigh. Mom, it is not what you think. Rachel and I have been talking about the future. We just thought it might be wise to explore some options to see what possibilities are out there. The word possibilities made my stomach turn. I pressed my hand to the counter, trying to steady my breath. This is not an option for you to explore, I said coldly. This is my home. He started again with his careful tone, the one he used with clients, not his mother. We are only concerned about you. That house is enormous. The upkeep must be exhausting. Imagine how much easier life would be if you did not have to worry about it. Think of the comfort of a community where everything is taken care of. I felt my voice sharpen. Do not pretend this is about my comfort. This is about money. How much is Reynolds offering you? Another pause, then a strained laugh. Mom, no one is offering anything yet. We are just looking. I wanted to shout to tell him I had held the sign in my hands, that his lies were brittle as glass. Instead, I said evenly, I know what I saw, Mark. Do not lie to me. He muttered something about needing to get back to work and ended the call. I stood in the silence of the kitchen phone, still warm against my ear, the echo of his words hanging like smoke. My son was part of this. My son had chosen her side. I turned and walked through the house, each room echoing memories. The dining room where birthdays had been celebrated, the parlor where Richard had read stories to the children, the kitchen where I had taught Peter to crack eggs into a bowl. All of it now reduced to a line item on their plan. My stomach churned as I imagined strangers touring through, commenting on floor plans, measuring windows, seeing nothing of what this house truly was. I stopped in the study, the envelope Richard had left still locked in the drawer. I unlocked it and spread the documents out once more, my hands steadying as I read his words again. These papers were my shield, proof that the house was more than property. but I knew evidence alone might not stop them if their greed pushed hard enough. By late afternoon, the sun cast long shadows across the yard. I heard children playing down the block, the sound of a lawnmower life moving on. Yet inside me, everything had shifted. I sat in Richard's old chair, the sign leaning against the wall like an accusation. Rachel's smug smile haunted me, her voice ringing in my ears as she raised that glass at the table. I realized this was no misunderstanding, no family disagreement that would fade with time. This was an attack, calculated and deliberate. They wanted me out. They wanted the house. As the evening drew near, I closed the curtains tightly and locked the doors. My reflection in the glass showed a woman worn by grief, but hardened by resolve. I whispered into the stillness that I would not surrender, that this fight had only just begun. The night settled heavy around the house, and I sat with the envelope in my lap, the papers rustling softly, as though Richard himself reminded me that he had prepared for this moment. I pressed them close to my chest, letting their weight steady me. Outside, the world hummed with the ordinary, but within these walls I knew the battle had already started and I would be ready for it. The night after I found the hidden sign, I hardly slept. I tossed under the sheets, my mind racing with Rachel's smirk, Mark's careful tone, the bold letters of "coming soon" that had burned into my eyes. By dawn, I sat at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee untouched, staring at the envelope Richard had left. The house creaked softly around me, a reminder that even in silence it was alive. I told myself I would find a way to fight, but I had no idea how. Just before noon, the phone rang. I almost ignored it, bracing for Rachel's false concern or Mark's excuses. Instead, a young voice I loved answered my dread. "Aunt Helen, it is Anna." Relief washed over me. John's daughter, my niece, calling from Boston. She explained quickly that she had come down to Fairfax for a long weekend and wanted to visit. I told her to come right away. An hour later, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Anna stood there with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her eyes bright but serious. She hugged me tightly, her arms grounding me in a way I had not realized I needed. When she pulled back, her expression shifted. "Aunt Helen, there is something I have to show you." We moved into the kitchen and she laid a folded sheet of paper on the table. My heart skipped as I opened it. The header bore the name Reynolds Real Estate. Beneath it, words that stole my breath. Projected sale value $7,000 $1,000. A list of developers' notes about demolition, even preliminary sketches for modern townhomes where my house now stood. My fingers trembled as I traced the lines. Anna leaned forward, her voice low. "I found it on Uncle Mark's printer last week. I was at the house dropping something off for Dad and no one was around. I should not have snooped, but something felt wrong. When I saw this, I knew I had to bring it to you." I sat back, stunned. My son had let Rachel turn him into a co-conspirator. The boy I raised, the man I had trusted, planning to sell the very house where he grew up for $7 million. The figure echoed in my mind, grotesque in its size, as if a price tag could be stapled to memories. Tears stung my eyes, but Anna's hand covered mine, steady and warm. "Do not cry," she said firmly. "You cannot let them push you aside. They are counting on you being quiet, being gentle. But you are not weak." Her conviction pierced the fog of despair. I looked at her, so young yet so certain, and felt something inside me straighten. I told her about the man with the camera, about the hidden sign, about Mark's evasive phone call. Each detail tightened her jaw. "They are moving faster than I thought," she muttered. We left the table and walked through the house together. I showed her the parlor where Richard had proposed, the staircase where Peter used to race his toy cars, the kitchen where I had taught her father to make biscuits as a boy. She stopped often, her gaze moving over the walls and floors, absorbing the weight of history. Aunt Helen, this is not just your house. It is the story of our family. It is worth more than $7 million. Her words steadied me. When we reached the study, I unlocked the drawer and showed her Richard's envelope. She read the letter quietly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she took in his foresight. He knew, she whispered. He knew this might happen. We spent the afternoon talking on the porch swing. The air was thick, but a breeze stirred the leaves above us. Anna told me she had been interning at a local newspaper in Boston, learning how to research, how to dig for truth. I can help, she said. If they are planning this, there will be more evidence. Emails, calls, meetings. If I find it, we can prove what they are doing. Her eagerness frightened me, but I also felt pride swell. Be careful, I warned. This could get ugly. She gave me a wry smile. I have grown up hearing about this house my whole life. If they think they can erase it, they are wrong. Later, we cooked dinner together. For a moment, the kitchen felt alive again, laughter bouncing against the cabinets, the smell of cornbread filling the air. But beneath the lightness, there was a current of tension. Every clink of silverware reminded me of the sign. Every pause in conversation pulled me back to the betrayal. When Anna left that evening, she hugged me again and promised to return the next day. I stood at the window watching her drive away, headlights fading down the road. The house fell silent once more. I returned to the study and placed the printout alongside Richard's papers. The evidence was building piece by piece. I sat in his old chair, the leather worn smooth by years of use, and stared at the growing pile of proof. My son and his wife were not merely careless with words. They had put my house on the market, attached a price, and mapped its destruction. The betrayal was complete, undeniable. But so was my resolve. I pressed the envelope to my chest, whispering into the stillness that I would fight. I was no longer alone. Anna's courage had lit something inside me that Rachel's cruelty could never extinguish. Outside, fireflies blinked in the dusk, tiny lights against the darkening yard. I rose, locked the doors, and turned off the lamps one by one. The house groaned as it settled into night, and I felt Richard's presence close by. With each step through the quiet halls, I carried not just fear, but the first flicker of defiance. 2 days later, Anna returned, her face pale, but her eyes alight with determination. She carried her backpack as if it held something fragile, and the moment we stepped into the kitchen, she set it gently on the table. Aunt Helen, I have to tell you something, she said, her voice low. I poured her a glass of iced tea, my hands trembling slightly, afraid of what she might say. She opened the backpack and pulled out her phone, glancing toward the windows as if someone might overhear. I recorded them, she whispered. Uncle Mark and Rachel. I blinked, startled. You did what? She nodded, pushing the phone closer to me. I was at the house last week. I stopped by to grab something from Dad's study while everyone was out, but then I heard voices in the den. I knew I shouldn't have, but I hit record. My pulse quickened as I reached for the phone. The screen glowed with a list of audio files. She tapped one, and the room filled with voices I knew too well. Rachel's tone was smooth, calculating. All we need is to establish she can't manage things on her own. If Dr. Simmons hears enough from us, he will recommend guardianship. Once that happens, the rest is simple. Mark's voice followed, hesitant. I don't know, Rachel. Mom seems fine most of the time. Just sure, of course she seems fine. But if we say we see confusion, memory lapses, maybe paranoia, the doctor has to take it seriously, then we get power of attorney. We put the house on the market. It will sell fast. 7 million mark. Think of what that could mean. The sound struck me like a blade. My own son's silence in the face of Rachel's scheme, his weak protest drowned out by her ambition. I felt the room tilt and gripped the edge of the table, tears burning at my eyes. Anna reached out quickly. I am sorry, Aunt Helen. I know I crossed a line, but I could not let this slide. I pressed a hand to my chest, struggling to catch my breath. My voice shook. If they find out you did this, they could come after you. She shook her head fiercely. Let them try. You needed to know the truth. This is proof. They cannot claim it is just concern anymore. I stared at her, pride and fear colliding inside me. She was risking herself for me, stepping into a battle she should never have been forced to face. I reached for her hand. Thank you, Anna. More than I can ever say. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Then I spoke carefully. We cannot just sit on this. We need to know what to do with it, how to use it. She nodded. You need a lawyer. The name came to me immediately, an old family friend, Gerald Hoffman, practicing in Fairfax for decades, steady as oak and sharp as ever. Richard had trusted him, and so did I. I told Anna my plan, and she agreed without hesitation. That afternoon, we drove together, the audio file safe on her phone, the printout from Reynolds Real Estate, tucked into my purse with Richard's envelope. My hands clenched the steering wheel as we passed rows of tidy houses, each one a reminder of what they wanted to reduce mine to. Anna sat beside me, quiet but alert, her eyes scanning the streets. When we reached Gerald's office, an old brick building with his name on the door in faded gold letters, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might shake me apart. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Gerald looked up from his desk as we entered, his bushy brows lifting in surprise before breaking into a smile. Helen Caldwell, he said warmly, rising to shake my hand. It has been too long. I introduced Anna, and once we settled into the chairs across from him, the weight of the moment settled on my shoulders. I opened my purse, laid out the documents, and finally nodded at Anna. She pressed play. The recording filled the office, Rachel's voice cutting sharp against the quiet walls. Gerald's expression darkened as the conversation unfolded, his fingers steepled in front of his mouth. When it ended, silence hung heavy. At last he spoke, his tone grave. This is serious. They are not just discussing possibilities. They are actively laying groundwork for guardianship fraud. My throat tightened. Can they succeed? Could a court actually strip me of my home? Gerald leaned back. If they convince a doctor to support their claims, if they gather statements from others, yes, it could happen. But with this, he tapped the phone, and these he gestured at Richard's letter and the real estate document. You have leverage. You have proof of intent. I exhaled slowly, gripping Anna's hand. Gerald leaned forward. The first step is to get a formal evaluation of your mental competency. Independent, ironclad. That way their claim crumbles before it gains traction. The second is to preserve and document these papers, the historical ones especially. If your house qualifies for landmark protection, it becomes nearly impossible to sell or alter even under guardianship. Anna's eyes widened, hope sparking in them. That would protect it completely. Gerald nodded. It is not quick, but it is strong. And finally he added, we need to be prepared legally. Guardianship battles can turn ugly. They may dig for ways to paint you as unstable. I sat up straighter, feeling the steel inside me solidify, then let them dig. I have nothing to hide. Gerald smiled faintly, admiration flickering in his tired eyes. I will help you, Helen. But you must be careful. Rachel is a lawyer. She knows how to maneuver. We left the office as dusk settled, the street lamps flickering on. Anna walked close beside me, her shoulders squared. For the first time in days, I felt less like prey and more like a woman with a plan. When we reached the car, I paused, looking back at the glow of Gerald's office window. Inside lay the beginnings of a strategy, the first steps toward defending everything Richard and I had built. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, the night air cool against my face. As we drove home in silence, I glanced at Anna. She stared out the window, the reflection of streetlights glinting in her eyes. I reached over and squeezed her hand. She looked back at me, determination steady in her gaze. In that moment, I knew we were in this together, for better or worse. The morning was heavy with clouds when Anna and I drove back into town, Richard's envelope resting on my lap, as if it were a living thing. My fingers clutched it tightly, the paper edges worn soft from handling. Neither of us spoke much during the ride. Anna kept her eyes on the road, her jaw set, determination in every line of her face. I studied her from the passenger seat, both grateful and fearful that she had stepped into a battle that should never have fallen on her shoulders. Gerald Hoffman's office stood on the corner of Main Street in a 2-story brick building that had been there longer than most people in Fairfax. The gold lettering on the window had faded, but his reputation had not. Inside, the waiting area smelled faintly of leather and old books. Gerald himself emerged from his office, tall and stooped, with sharp eyes that still carried the weight of decades in court. "Helen," he said warmly, extending his hand, "it has been far too long." We followed him inside the walls lined with shelves of law journals and photographs from community events. Once we settled into the heavy chairs across from his oak desk, Gerald folded his hands and gave me a long, steady look. "I understand you have a problem." I set the envelope on the desk and explained everything, starting with Rachel's toast at the July 4th lunch, the man with the camera, the hidden sign, and finally Anna's discovery. When I finished, Anna unlocked her phone and played the recording. Rachel's cold voice filled the office, plotting guardianship and the $7 million sale as if she were discussing a dinner reservation. Mark's hesitant replies only deepened the sting. When the recording ended, Gerald leaned back, his expression grave. "That is not mere speculation. That is intent." He tapped the desk with one finger. "Helen, the good news is this. The house is entirely in your name. There is no joint ownership, no trust that can be manipulated. That is a strong position." But he paused. "If they pursue guardianship, things can become complicated quickly." My heart tightened. Could they take everything away from me? Gerald's eyes softened. Guardianship is a serious process. They would need to present medical testimony, perhaps convince a doctor that you are no longer competent. Once a court grants it, they would control your finances, your home, even your daily choices. Anna leaned forward. "But we have this," she said, holding up the phone. Gerald nodded. "And it is powerful. But timing is everything. If we reveal it too soon, they will prepare their defenses. If too late, damage might already be done. We need to build a strategy." He outlined it carefully. "First, you undergo a comprehensive cognitive evaluation from an independent specialist. Certified, documented, undeniable. Second, we prepare the historical documents Richard left. If the property gains preliminary protection as a landmark, it will be nearly impossible for them to sell or demolish guardianship or not. Third, we wait. Let them dig their own hole. Once they move publicly, we present the evidence, including the recording, the printout Anna found, and even that sign. I felt my spine straighten as I listened. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground beneath my feet. Gerald adjusted his glasses. One more thing. Rachel is a lawyer. She knows the system and she will use it. That means she will try to intimidate you, perhaps, even manipulate people around you. You must remain steady no matter what she says. I nodded firmly, though fear still gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Gerald's words echoed in my head. Intimidation, manipulation, Rachel's weapons. That evening, after Anna and I returned home, I stood at the kitchen counter making tea when the phone rang. The sound startled me sharp in the quiet house. I answered, and her voice slid through the line smooth as silk. "Helen, I hear you have been busy, running around town talking to people." I gripped the receiver tighter, my knuckles whitening. Rachel's laugh followed, light but cutting. "I hope you are not exhausting yourself with futile efforts. The law can be such a heavy thing to fight." I forced my voice to remain calm. "I am quite capable of managing myself." Her tone shifted sharp beneath the sweetness. "You really should think carefully. It would be awful if you wasted your last years chasing something you cannot win." A spark of anger flared in me. "You may think you understand the law, Rachel, but you do not understand me." She paused, perhaps startled by the steel in my tone, then gave a low chuckle. "We will see." The line went dead. I set the phone down carefully, though my hands shook. Anna had been standing in the doorway listening. "Was that her?" she asked. I nodded. "She is trying to rattle me." Anna stepped closer, her expression fierce. "Then let her try. We have truth on our side." Later that night, we spread Richard's documents across the study desk. Anna helped me sort the letters and authentication papers into folders. We labeled each set, preparing for the Historical Society submission Gerald had recommended. The work steadied me. The act of organizing, of setting things in order, reminded me of my teaching years. Only this time, the lesson was survival. When we finally finished, I sat back in Richard's chair, exhausted but steadier. Anna leaned against the desk, her young face lit by the desk lamp. "Aunt Helen," she said softly, "you are not alone in this." I reached for her hand, grateful beyond words. The house was quiet, the night heavy around us. Somewhere outside, a dog barked in the distance, then silence fell again. I closed the folder with Richard's papers and locked them back in the drawer, the key cool in my palm. Tomorrow we would begin the evaluations, the applications, the careful building of a defense. For now, I allowed myself to breathe, to rest in the knowledge that I had a plan and that Rachel's laughter no longer rang like victory in my ears. 2 weeks later, I stood at the mailbox at the edge of my driveway, the air heavy with August heat cicadas shrieking from the trees. Inside the stack of envelopes sat one with the seal of the Fairfax County Court. My hands trembled as I tore it open, scanning the black print that blurred before my eyes. Petition for guardianship, filed by Mark Caldwell and Rachel Caldwell. The words cut like a blade. They were truly doing it, dragging me into court as if I were incapable, as if I were already gone. I carried the letter back to the porch and sank into the rocking chair, my breath shallow. Anger surged in me, tangled with fear. Guardianship meant loss of control, the keys to my own home snatched from my hand. My chest tightened until Anna's voice pulled me back. "Aunt Helen, What is it? She stood in the doorway, her face pale as she read the letter. Her jaw clenched. They are going through with it. Inside, I set the letter on the kitchen counter. My tea sat cooling in its cup untouched. Anna read the words again, shaking her head. They claim you are forgetful, emotional, unable to manage the house. Lies. I could feel tears burning, but refused to let them fall. Lies, yes, but dressed in legal clothing. Rachel would know exactly how to make them sound convincing. That same day, Gerald called, his voice low but steady. Helen, the petition has been filed. We have time to respond, but we must move quickly. He explained the steps, the evaluations, the evidence we had to line up. His calm gave me something to hold on to. Meanwhile, I learned Rachel had not stopped at the courthouse. She had written directly to Dr. Simmons, my family physician, framing her request as concern. She asked for copies of my records, pointing to supposed lapses she had observed. Gerald warned me that such a letter coming from a practicing attorney carried weight. My stomach turned at the thought of her invading even my doctor's office, spinning webs with her smooth words. Word of Rachel's maneuvering had begun to seep into her workplace, too. At Whitman & Rowe, the law firm where she was a partner, Colleen Harris, one of her colleagues, noticed things. Colleen had always been sharp, fair, and known for questioning motives. She overheard Rachel discussing the guardianship case in tones too personal, too heated for what should have been detached legal analysis. Whispers began to stir that Rachel was bending her position for personal gain. I did not know this then, but later it would prove to be a crack in Rachel's armor. That night, I sat in my study, the letter from the court lying beside Richard's documents. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps of someone coming to take it away. I closed my eyes and pressed my palm against the cool desk. Anger rose again, fierce and sharp. They could file their papers, they could whisper to doctors, but they would not break me. Anna brought me supper, her expression tight. We have to fight back harder. She laid her phone on the desk, the recording still there, the proof Rachel and Mark could never erase. My chest tightened at the thought of playing it in court, of hearing Rachel's cold voice fill the chamber. It would be my weapon, but Gerald's words echoed. Timing is everything. The days that followed blurred with preparations. Gerald arranged my independent evaluation, and I met with a specialist who walked me through memory tests, problem-solving tasks, even drawing a clock face. I completed each with steady focus, my teacher's discipline returning after years of retirement. When he finished, the doctor looked at me with a kind smile. Helen, you are sharper than most 50-year-olds I see. Relief washed over me, though I knew the battle was far from over. Back home, Anna and I sorted Richard's historical documents into folders labeled for the Historical Society. We photographed each page, scanned them onto her laptop, and created copies for safekeeping. As we worked, I felt Richard's presence close, his passion for history, now our shield. Still dread lurked each time the phone rang. Rachel called again one evening, her voice laced with sarcasm. Helen, I heard about your little appointment. How exhausting that must have been for you. I held the receiver tightly. I am perfectly fine, Rachel. Her laugh was cold. You cannot fight the law. No doctor's note will change that. You will see soon enough. I hung up before she could say more, my hands shaking. Anna stood in the doorway again, her face flushed with anger. She is trying to break you. Do not let her. I nodded, though the tremor in my chest betrayed me. That night, I walked the halls of the house, slowly touching the door frames, the photos, the worn banister of the stairs. Every corner reminded me what was at stake. They wanted me out, but I would not leave willingly. When I returned to the study, Anna was still awake, typing notes into her laptop. She looked up, her eyes fierce. "Aunt Helen, we have the truth. We just need to hold steady." I sat beside her, drawing strength from her presence. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, and rain began to fall against the windows. I listened to the storm and whispered to myself that if Rachel thought she could erase me, she had chosen the wrong fight. The morning after the envelope arrived, I sat in the kitchen staring at it on the counter, my coffee long gone cold. Every time my eyes landed on the black letters of Fairfax County Court, my chest tightened. That was when the front door opened and John's voice rang through the hall. "Mom, it's me." He appeared with a suitcase in his hand and determination in his face. "I came down from Boston. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." I rose slowly, relief flooding me as I embraced him. He smelled of city rain and the faint cologne Richard used to wear, and for a brief moment I felt steady again. "You shouldn't have to do this," I whispered, but John shook his head. "I should have come sooner. Rachel and Mark have gone too far." Anna joined us, her arms wrapping tightly around her father. The three of us stood in the entryway, the house suddenly less hollow with their presence. For the first time since this nightmare began, I did not feel entirely surrounded. But the peace did not last. That evening, Mark called, his voice clipped. "We need to talk." I agreed, though dread coiled in my stomach. Within the hour, their car pulled into the driveway. Rachel stepped out first, her heels clicking across the stone path, her expression composed but sharp. Mark followed, carrying a thin folder under his arm. Behind them trailed Peter, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. The moment they entered the living room, tension filled the air. John stood by my side, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on his brother. Rachel perched on the edge of the sofa, crossing her legs, while Mark remained standing, glancing between us. John spoke first, his voice low but heavy with fury. "You filed for guardianship against your own mother. Do you even hear yourself, Mark?" Mark stiffened. "We're doing what needs to be done. Mom can't handle this house anymore. She forgets things, she gets emotional. This is the best way forward." My throat burned, but before I could speak, John stepped closer. "Don't you dare use her humanity against her. She's sharp, she's strong, and you know it. This isn't about her safety. This is about money. $7 million. Rachel's voice slid in smooth and cold. "You're twisting our motives. The truth is, this property is far too much for one woman in her 70s. Guardianship ensures she's cared for." John's laugh was bitter. "Cared for or controlled? Which is it?" Mark's face flushed. "You don't understand, John. I live here. I see the reality every day." John's eyes narrowed. "No, you see what Rachel wants you to see. You've let her poison your judgment. You used to stand up for Mom. Now you're standing against her." Rachel's eyes glinted as she leaned forward. "This isn't poison. It's practicality. Do you really think an old house like this is safe? Helen could trip on the stairs, leave the stove on. The risk is real." Her words sliced through me, but before I could respond, Peter spoke. His voice cracked at first, but he lifted his chin. "Grandma's fine. She doesn't forget. She talks with me. She helps me with homework. She remembers everything." "She's not what you're saying." The room froze. Rachel's face tightened, her practiced calm slipping. Mark turned to his son, eyes wide. "Peter, you don't understand." Peter stepped forward. his fists clenched. I understand enough. You're trying to take away her house, and it's wrong. Emotion surged in my chest so fiercely I had to grip the arm of the chair. My grandson, who had always been quiet in the shadow of his parents, was standing tall, his voice echoing with conviction. Rachel forced a thin smile. Children don't see the full picture. They cling to comfort instead of reality. That's why adults have to make the hard choices. Peter's eyes blazed. Sometimes adults make the wrong choices. Silence fell thick and suffocating. John broke it, his voice sharp as steel. You won't get away with this. Mom has people on her side. We will fight you every step of the way. Mark's lips parted, his face torn between anger and shame. His eyes darted to Peter, then to me, then back to John. For a flicker of a moment, I saw hesitation in him, the boy he once was still buried inside. But Rachel's hand touched his arm, grounding him back in her grip. We should go, she said, her tone icy. This isn't over. They turned toward the door, Mark following stiffly Peter, lingering a heartbeat longer. He met my eyes, his own filled with sorrow, but also strength. Then he left the door, shutting hard behind them. The house was silent again, except for the clock ticking in the hall. I sank into my chair, my body trembling with exhaustion. John knelt beside me, gripping my hand. We'll fight, Mom. You're not alone anymore. Anna leaned against the doorway, her eyes wet but steady. She looked at her cousin's empty place in the room, then back at me. Aunt Helen, he's with us. He just proved it. My heart ached with grief but swelled with hope. For the first time in this brutal war, I felt the tide beginning to shift. My family was torn but not broken. I looked at John, at Anna, at the faint memory of Peter's voice ringing through the room, and I whispered silently to Richard that we still had a chance. The courthouse in Fairfax rose before me like a fortress, its stone steps broad and unyielding under the morning sun. I climbed them slowly, my hand gripping John's arm, while Anna walked just behind with Gerald clutching the briefcase that held our lifeline. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. This was not just about me. It was about Richard's memory, the house he had loved, and the generations who had called it home. Inside the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs until the bailiff called for silence. The walls seemed to close in, paneled in dark wood that smelled faintly of polish. I sat at our table, my hands folded tightly, while across the aisle, Rachel arranged her papers with theatrical precision. Mark sat stiffly beside her, his suit too large for his narrow shoulders, his eyes avoiding mine. Peter sat behind them, his posture slumped, torn between parents and conscience. Judge Whitaker entered, his robe flowing as he settled into his seat. He was an older man with sharp eyes, the kind that had seen through countless lies. The gavel struck once, and Rachel rose with practiced confidence. Your Honor, she began. Helen Caldwell is no longer able to manage her affairs. She has exhibited forgetfulness, emotional instability, and is incapable of maintaining her property responsibly. Guardianship is necessary for her safety and well-being. Her voice rang smooth and commanding, but I could hear the hollowness behind it. Mark added, his tone softer but laced with resignation. We only want what's best for my mother. Gerald stood calmly adjusting his glasses before speaking. With permission. Your Honor, I submit the independent medical evaluation of Mrs. Caldwell conducted by Dr. Adams of Arlington. The report clearly affirms she is of sound mind and fully competent. The judge scanned the document, his brow lifting. According to this, Mrs. Caldwell's cognitive scores are excellent, well above average for her age. He set the paper aside. That carries significant weight. Rachel's eyes narrowed, her smile thin. One evaluation cannot erase what we've witnessed. She forgets conversations, she overreacts, she left a family gathering in tears. These are not isolated incidents. I clenched my fists, but Gerald lifted a hand to still me. Anecdotes are not admissible evidence, he countered, and this court knows the difference. The judge tapped his pen on the bench, his gaze moving between us. I will need further proof before making any determination. If there is more to present, now is the appropriate time. Gerald nodded toward Anna. My niece rose slowly, every step measured as she walked to the witness stand. She swore the oath, her voice clear, though her hands trembled. She lifted her phone and held it carefully. Your Honor, I have a recording. It is of Rachel and Mark discussing guardianship, not as a means of care, but as a path to sell my aunt's home for $7 million. Rachel bolted upright, her voice sharp as glass. Objection! That recording is inadmissible. It was obtained without consent. The judge raised his hand. Sit down, Mrs. Caldwell. I will review its relevance. Anna pressed play. Rachel's voice filled the courtroom, cold and unflinching. All we need is to make the doctor see confusion. Once guardianship is granted, we get power of attorney, put the house on the market. $7 million, Mark. Think of what that could mean. Mark's reply followed, hesitant but damning. I don't know, Rachel. Mom seems fine. Rachel's laugh came next, sharp and cruel. Of course she seems fine. But if we say otherwise, it becomes truth. Gasps rippled across the room. Even the court reporter paused before her fingers resumed tapping the keys. I felt my stomach twist as I listened, the betrayal laid bare in every syllable. John's jaw tightened beside me, his glare fixed on his brother. When the recording ended, silence pressed heavy. Judge Whitaker leaned back, removing his glasses to polish them slowly. This recording raises grave concerns, he said at last. It directly contradicts the claim that this petition is motivated by care. Rachel's voice rose again, desperate now. Your Honor, that was taken out of context. We were discussing possibilities, not decisions. The judge cut her off, his tone sharp. I heard enough to establish intent. At the very least, it casts serious doubt on the integrity of this petition. He set the papers aside and looked directly at me. Mrs. Caldwell, until further investigation is completed, you will retain full control of your estate. This petition is denied in its current form. The gavel came down, the sound echoing like a thunderclap through the chamber. Rachel's face flushed scarlet, her composure shattering as she gathered her papers with jerky movements. Mark sat frozen, his shoulders slumped, unable to look at me or his own son. Peter stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the bench, the conflict written across his young face. Anna stepped down from the stand and returned to me, her eyes wet but bright. I reached for her hand, my voice unsteady. You were brave beyond your years. She whispered back. They needed to hear the truth. As we walked out into the sunlight, the air felt lighter, though the battle was far from over. Gerald adjusted his tie and spoke quietly. Today was a victory, but they will not stop. We must be ready for whatever comes next. John placed a steady hand on my back. We'll face it together, Mom. The courthouse loomed behind us, its windows glinting in the afternoon sun, but I no longer felt its shadow pressing down. For now I still held my home. For now the truth had been heard. News traveled faster than I expected. Within days of the hearing, whispers spread through Rachel's law firm, Harrison and Blake, about the recording that had played in open court. Colleen Harris, who had worked alongside Rachel for years, quietly reached out to the partners. She had already harbored doubts about the way Rachel blurred the line between personal interest and professional duty, and now she had proof that those suspicions were justified. One evening, Gerald called me with a tone of grim satisfaction. "They've launched an internal investigation, Helen. Harrison and Blake cannot afford to look complicit in a case of elder exploitation. Rachel has been suspended from all partnership duties while they review the facts." I gripped the phone, stunned. For a woman who measured her worth by her title, suspension was the first crack in her carefully polished facade. Mark, meanwhile, could not hide from the storm. The Fairfax Chronicle ran an article headlined, "Son Accused of Betraying Elderly Mother in $7 million Guardianship Plot." Neighbors stopped him in the grocery store, whispering as he passed. Parents at Peter's school gave him sideways glances. At church, people turned away. What Rachel had framed as concern was now exposed for greed, and the community was not forgiving. Peter began avoiding his father altogether. Instead, he came to my house after school, slipping through the back door with his backpack slung low. He sat at the kitchen table telling me about his classes, his friends, the college tours he hoped to take. His laughter filled the rooms that had grown so heavy in recent months. Sometimes I caught him watching me as if to reassure himself that I was truly well, that the lies his parents had spoken were nothing more than smoke. One afternoon he said quietly, "Grandma, I don't understand how Dad could let this happen." I reached for his hand. "People make choices, Peter, sometimes bad ones. What matters is that you know right from wrong, and you've chosen to stand with truth." He nodded, his young face set with determination beyond his years. At the same time, Professor Wallace worked with me to finalize the application for historical designation of the house. We spread Richard's old documents across the study desk, photographing, cataloging, and writing statements. The Revolutionary War correspondence authenticated years earlier became the backbone of the submission. When the packet was complete, Wallace carried it to the county office himself. Weeks later, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the Fairfax County Historical Commission. My hand shook as I opened it. Preliminary protective status granted. Effective immediately, no demolition, development, or sale could proceed without the Commission's oversight. Tears filled my eyes as I whispered to Richard that we had done it. We had safeguarded the home. The news broke publicly the following day. Local papers ran with the headline, "Historic Caldwell House Receives Temporary Landmark Protection Amid Family Dispute." What might have been a private tragedy was now entwined with community pride. Neighbors who had known me for decades stopped by to congratulate me, bringing flowers and baked goods. The house that Rachel wanted to erase was now celebrated as part of Virginia's history. The contrast with Rachel's world was stark. Harrison and Blake issued a public statement that they were investigating one of their partners for possible ethical violations. Colleen Ever-Precise testified that Rachel had boasted about using guardianship law to secure personal gain. The board wasted no time in suspending her caseload. I imagined her walking out of that gleaming office building, head held high for the cameras, but eyes blazing with fury. Mark bore the humiliation differently. He shrank into himself, retreating from colleagues and friends. The betrayal of a son was hard enough, but seeing him collapse under public shame twisted my heart in ways I could not explain. Anger and grief battled within me every time I thought of him. Yet when I looked at Peter or Anna, I knew I had to keep walking forward. One night I sat with John on the porch, the cicadas singing in the humid air. He stared out across the yard, his jaw tight. "They're falling apart, Mom. Karma's finally caught up." I sipped my tea, slowly watching the moonlight touch the roofline of the old house. "Yes," I said softly, but the wreckage still cuts. He turned to me, his eyes fierce. "And yet you stood your ground. You saved this home." The following week, the Historical Commission invited me to speak at a community meeting. Standing before a crowd of neighbors, students, and reporters, I told them about Richard's discovery in the walls of the East Wing, about Jonathan Caldwell's letters, and about the promise to preserve the house not only as my home, but as a piece of American history. Applause filled the hall, and for the first time in months, I felt not just defended, but celebrated. Rachel's name was whispered in different circles now, not as a respected attorney, but as a cautionary tale. Mark struggled in her shadow, his reputation crumbling with hers. They had tried to strip me of dignity of home of history itself, and instead, they had lost their standing in the very community they sought to impress. Sitting at my desk that night, the letter of protection framed beside Richard's photograph, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Justice was not always swift, but when it came with weight. Rachel and Mark had built their scheme on greed, and now the very walls they coveted had risen against them. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper. As I stepped through its doors for the final hearing, the cool marble beneath my shoes steadying me as if the building itself knew I needed strength. Gerald walked ahead with his briefcase. Anna held my arm tightly, and John stayed close to my other side. The room was nearly full when we entered, with neighbors, reporters, and curious townspeople whispering as we took our seats. At the opposite table, Rachel sat rigid, her once flawless suit hanging loosely, her expression brittle. Mark slouched beside her, his eyes sunken, his shoulders curved in defeat. Judge Whitaker entered with his usual gravity, his gavel striking once to quiet the room. "Today we are here to determine the matter of guardianship and ownership," he began. I felt my breath catch, then slowly release as Gerald stood. "Your Honor, the facts speak plainly. Mrs. Caldwell has been evaluated independently and found competent in every respect. The petition filed by her son and daughter-in-law is not about protection. It is about profit." He laid out the documents in order: the medical evaluations signed by Dr. Adams, the letter from the Fairfax Historical Commission granting protective status, and the transcript of Anna's recording. Each piece was like a stone added to the wall of my defense. Rachel rose, her voice sharp but shaking. "This has all been mischaracterized. My client and I acted only out of genuine concern. Guardianship was meant to provide safety and structure for Mrs. Caldwell." She glanced at Mark, urging him to speak, but he only shifted uncomfortably. The judge looked down at the papers, then back up at Rachel. "And how do you explain the recording where you explicitly discuss selling the property for $7 million? Rachel froze, her mouth opening, then closing without sound. Mark attempted to speak, but the judge's eyes silenced him. Gerald's voice carried steady authority. The petitioner's own words reveal motive. This was not about safety. It was about money. And while they schemed, Mrs. Caldwell preserved both her independence and a property of significant historical value to this county. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy enough to crush us. Then Judge Whitaker spoke with finality. "The petition for guardianship is denied. Mrs. Caldwell retains full legal authority over her affairs. Furthermore, this court recognizes the protective ruling of the Historical Commission. This home cannot be sold, demolished, or transferred without her express consent." He lifted the gavel and brought it down hard. Case closed. The sound reverberated like thunder. My knees wobbled, but John's hand steadied me. Anna pressed a tissue into my palm, her eyes bright with tears. Behind us, I heard whispers from neighbors who had gathered some murmuring words like justice and shame. Rachel collapsed back into her chair, her face pale, her mask of control shattered. Mark stared at the table, unable to look at anyone, least of all Peter, who sat in the back row. My grandson stood quietly, his chin raised, his eyes meeting mine with a courage that reminded me so much of Richard. When the session ended and the room emptied, Rachel hurried past reporters without speaking, her heels clattering down the hallway. Mark followed sluggishly, his shoulders slumped. Peter remained with me, walking out of the courthouse beside John and Anna. "Grandma, you won," he whispered. I smiled faintly. "No, Peter, we all did." News spread quickly. Within days, Harrison and Blake announced Rachel's removal from the firm. Colleagues confirmed she had violated ethical rules by using her legal position for personal gain. Her name was stripped from the partnership roster and her career was left in ruins. Local papers covered it relentlessly, printing headlines about betrayal, greed, and downfall. Mark fared no better. The community that once admired him turned cold. At church, pews shifted when he entered. At the grocery store, familiar faces looked away. And at home, his own son avoided him, spending more time with me. The boy who once hung his head in silence had found his voice, and it was not in support of his father's betrayal. Meanwhile, Professor Wallace delivered joyous news. The county commission had advanced my home from preliminary protection to full landmark designation. He handed me the official certificate with a smile that reached his eyes. "This house is now untouchable, Helen. It belongs not only to you, but to history." I pressed the paper to my chest, tears spilling freely as I whispered thanks to Richard for guiding me even from beyond. That evening, standing in the garden as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I looked back at the red brick walls of the house. I remembered Richard on the porch, hammer in hand, restoring the beams. I remembered my boys running through the grass, their laughter echoing. I remembered Anna's face when she first arrived to help me, and Peter's steady eyes in the courtroom. This home had held our sorrows and our joys, and it would continue to stand long after me. John joined me on the porch, his arm warm around my shoulders. "You're not just surviving, Mom," he said softly. "You've won." Anna sat nearby, her laptop on her knees, working quietly while Peter raked leaves along the path. The sound of their voices and laughter carried in the air, and for the first time in many months, I felt peace. I whispered to the house, to the trees, to Richard's memory. "I am not a burden. I am the foundation." The words felt like truth etched into the very soil. This fight had tested me in every way, but it had also shown me who I was and who I had beside me. Justice had spoken. Greed had crumbled. And the memory of love and sacrifice endured stronger than any scheme. As I share this story now, I wonder about you listening. Have you seen moments where justice prevailed in your family, where truth outlasted betrayal, where memory and love carried the day? Share your own stories of family, of justice, of legacy, because these stories remind us all that we are not defined by those who try to erase us, but by the foundations we build and protect.